Every night for 11 summers the first did a head count of my cabin before lights out, and every night for 11 summers the number came out to 7, even though I only ever had 6 beds. I never found the 7th kid. Not once. Not even when I checked every bunk myself with a flashlight and my own 2 hands. I was 19 the first summer I worked at Camp Kittatinny, up in the hills past the reservoir, the kind of place where the phone line stuttered every time it rained and the nearest town was 40 minutes down a dirt road. I ran cabin 4, 6 girls, ages 9 and 10. Every night after brushing teeth and story time, I stood in the doorway with my clipboard and counted heads before signing off in the logbook. 6 names. 6 beds. Nothing complicated about it, or so I thought going in. The first time I counted 7, I figured I'd miscounted. It happens. A kid shifts under a blanket right as you're counting, you lose track, you start over. I recounted from the doorway and got 6 faces I recognized.
But when I swept the flashlight across the room one more time out of habit, counting shapes under blankets instead of faces, there were 7 lumps and 6 beds.
I walked the room. 6 kids, wide awake or asleep, nothing extra anywhere. I told myself a rolled sleeping bag had thrown off my count and left it at that. It kept happening. Not every night, maybe twice a week, always the same pattern. 7 from the doorway, 6 once I got close enough to touch each kid. I started doing the walkthrough first and the doorway count second, thinking that would fix whatever was going wrong with my eyes. It didn't matter what order I did it in. The doorway count was always the one that came out wrong. I brought it up to another counselor, a guy named Marcus who ran cabin 6 across the fire pit and had been at the camp 3 summers longer than me. I expected him to laugh. Instead, he went quiet and asked which cabin I had. When I said cabin 4, he said, "Yeah, that one does that, the same way you'd mention a cabin having bad water pressure." He wouldn't say more, just told me to ask the kitchen manager, who'd been at the camp since the 70s. I caught Dot the next afternoon peeling potatoes at the steel sink behind the mess hall. She didn't stop peeling when I asked about cabin 4.
She said there'd been a fire in an older version of that cabin before it got rebuilt in '81, and the girl hadn't made it out in time.
She said the camp didn't like the story getting around because it scared off parents, so the older staff had just quietly agreed not to talk about it. And every counselor who ran cabin 4 long enough eventually learned on their own to stop counting from the doorway. I didn't believe her, not really. I figured it was a story staff told new hires to spook them, the kind of thing that grows with each retelling over 40 years. But I started walking to each bed first after that instead of counting from the door, and for a few weeks the number held steady at 6. I decided that had solved it. The trick, I told myself, had just been where I stood. Then one night during lights out, a quiet camper named Priya asked me why I always looked at the 7th bed. I told her we only had 6 beds. She said she knew that.
She said she meant the space between her bed and the window, where she said a girl sat sometimes and watched the room until everyone fell asleep.
I asked what the girl looked like.
Priya said she couldn't tell, because the girl always sat with her knees pulled up to her chest and her head down, like she was waiting for something to be over.
I didn't sleep well that night. I told myself an 8-year-old's imagination and decades of counselor folklore had simply fed into each other, that Priya had picked up some version of the fire story from another camper and it had lodged itself where kids' fears live. That explanation got me through the rest of that summer, and it worked well enough that I came back for a 12th year, and then didn't think much about any of it for a long stretch after. By my last few summers, the 7 count didn't spook me anymore. I'd see 7 from the doorway, walk the room, find 6, and move on with my night without breaking stride. It became background noise, the kind of thing you stop reacting to once you've explained it away enough times. What I'd never done, in over a decade, was actually address the 7th shape directly. I always just walked toward it and let it quietly resolve into 6, the way you'd wait out static on a radio. On the last night of my final summer, knowing I wasn't coming back the following year, I did the count from the doorway. 7, same as always.
Instead of walking the room like I had 1,000 times before, I stayed where I was and said, out loud, I see you.
I don't fully know why. Maybe 11 years of curiosity finally outweighed the habit of looking away.
The 7th shape didn't move. But one of the 6 girls actually, verifiably in her bed, a 10-year-old named Ashley, sat straight up and asked me, in a flat, unbothered voice, if I meant her sister.
I told her I didn't know she had a sister. She said her sister used to come to this camp a long time ago, before Ashley was born, and that her mom never liked to talk about her, and that sometimes when Ashley slept somewhere new, her sister came to make sure she was okay. I asked Ashley her sister's name. She told me, plainly, like it cost her nothing. I didn't recognize it that night. I want to say that's where this ends, that I looked it up later and found nothing, and that would be a tidy way to close it out. But I did look, once I got home.
I found an old camp newsletter from 1979 in a box of donated archives, one paragraph about a cabin fire and a camper who hadn't made it out, and the first name in that paragraph matched the one Ashley gave me.
I never told Ashley's family what I found. I didn't see what good it would do. I finished out the summer, drove out through the camp gate for the last time, and I haven't been back since. But I still count rooms out of habit now, in hotels, in my own house when my nieces stay over, and more than once the number has come out one higher than it should. I always walk toward it now instead of looking away. It always resolves back down to what it should be.
I just don't know anymore what resolves actually means, or where the extra one goes when it stops being 7.
The camp assigned me the same swim buddy 3 summers running, a boy named Colin who held my hand under the diving dock and told me not to look down, and I only found out in my 3rd summer that Colin had drowned in that lake 9 years before I was even born. I was 8 the first time I went to Camp Alder Run, a lake camp 2 hours from home, the kind with a bell that rang for meals and a buddy board by the dock where you flipped a wooden tag with your name on it to show you were paired up and accounted for. On day 1, a counselor walked me down to the water for the swim test and told me my buddy for the summer would be a boy named Colin, a little older than me, who already knew the lake. I remember him waiting at the end of the dock, sunburned across the nose, wearing a faded blue swim shirt that looked older than the ones the camp store sold. Colin was good to me that first summer. He showed me where the drop-off was so I wouldn't swim over it by accident, taught me to hold my breath longer, told me which part of the dock had a loose board you could catch your foot on. We only ever talked at the water. I'd look for him at breakfast or during free time and never spot him, and when I asked other kids in my cabin if they knew Colin, most of them just shrugged and said they had their own buddy, somebody different each of them seemed to already know by name. The 2nd summer, I came back and Colin was still my assigned buddy, waiting at the same spot on the dock, looking exactly like he had the year before. Not a little older, not a little taller, the same sunburned nose and the same faded blue shirt. I didn't think much of it at 8 and 9 years old. Kids don't audit each other's height that closely. What I did notice, because it stuck with me, was that he still only ever showed up at the water, and he still knew things about the lake that felt older than a normal camper would know, like exactly where the cold spring came up from the bottom, or which mornings the fog would sit low enough that the lifeguard chair couldn't see the dock. By my third summer I was 10, sharper about things, and I started asking questions. I asked a counselor named Ray, who ran the lakefront that year, if she knew Colin. She checked her buddy board roster, ran her finger down the list, and told me there was no Colin assigned to lakefront that summer, or any summer she had records for. I told her he was right there, at the end of the dock, and pointed.
She looked where I was pointing for a long moment and said she didn't see anyone.
I want to be clear that Colin didn't disappear when she said that.
He stayed exactly where he was, watching us, not reacting at all, like the conversation didn't concern him.
Ray told me to come sit by her for the rest of the swim period instead of going back out with my buddy, and she didn't argue with me about what I'd seen, which somehow scared me more than if she'd told me I was imagining things. That night I couldn't sleep, and I did something I probably shouldn't have, which was sneak down to the camp office where the older staff kept a shelf of donated local history books nobody ever opened. I found a slim one about the lake, printed sometime in the 80s, and near the back was a short section about a boy who drowned near the camp dock a long time before the camp even had that name, caught in a current near the drop-off during a storm that came in faster than anyone expected.
The book didn't give a last name, just Colin, 9 years old, and a date that put his death almost 2 decades before I was born.
I kept going back to the water after that, because the buddy system meant I had to, and because some part of me wasn't ready to stop. Colin was still there every day, same as always, and if anything he seemed more careful with me that summer, steering me away from the drop-off more than he needed to, telling me twice in 1 week not to swim out past the second buoy even on calm days. I asked him once, straight out, if he was the boy from the book.
He didn't answer the question.
He just told me the lake gets colder than it looks, and that some parts of it don't let go easy once they've got you. On the last day of that summer, standing at the end of the dock while the other kids loaded up the buses, Colin told me he wouldn't be my buddy again. I asked why, and he said I was getting old enough to watch the water myself now, and that he had other kids to watch. I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now, or at least I think I do. I didn't go back to Camp Alder Run for 11 years. I went back as a counselor, mostly out of nostalgia, mostly because I wanted to see the dock again as an adult and prove to myself it had all been an 8-year-old's imagination stitched together with an old library book. I got assigned to help run the lakefront, which meant checking the buddy board every hour. A week into the summer, a small girl in my group came up to me during free swim and asked if it was normal that her buddy only ever showed up at the water. I asked her his name.
She told me it wasn't him, it was a girl, a little older, wearing an old-looking swimsuit, who taught her where the cold spring was and which mornings the fog sat low over the dock.
I checked the buddy board. There was no name on it that matched what she described, and there never had been. I still work there most summers. I still check the board every hour, same as I'm supposed to.
Some mornings, when the fog sits low the way Colin used to warn me about, I stand at the end of the dock a while before I ring the swim bell, just watching the water, and I don't call anyone in until I'm sure I've counted every kid that's actually mine.
On my last summer guiding canoe trips, I paddled 6 kids out to an island that doesn't exist on any map of that lake, and when we got back to shore that evening, we came back with 7. I worked the canoe program at Camp Wabash for 4 summers, taking small groups out for overnight trips on Lake Secoit, a long body of water with more coves and inlets than anyone had bothered to chart properly. We used a laminated map at the boathouse, decades old, that showed the main shoreline and the 2 islands campers were allowed to camp on. Everyone who worked the waterfront long enough had heard about a 3rd island somewhere past the northern coves, one that showed up in some tellings and not others. One older guide's mentioned only in the vague way people mention something they've never personally confirmed. My trip that week was 6 kids, 11 and 12 years old, 3 canoes, 1 night out. We left after breakfast, paddled the marked route up through the coves, and by early afternoon a fog rolled in low over the water faster than the forecast had said it would. Fog on that lake usually burned off fast, so I wasn't overly worried, but this one sat thick and didn't move, and within 20 minutes I couldn't see the shoreline in any direction, just gray water and gray air and the shapes of the other 2 canoes staying close by instinct. We paddled toward what I judged to be the direction of our planned campsite, going slow, calling out to keep the canoes together. After maybe 40 minutes of that, one of the kids in the lead canoe called back that he could see land. I couldn't match it to anything on our laminated map, no matter how I turned it over in my head against the shoreline we were approaching, but with the fog as thick as it was and the light already turning toward evening, I made the call to land there and figure out our exact position once the fog cleared instead of paddling blind looking for the real site. The island was small, maybe the size of a soccer field, with old-growth trees that seemed too big for how little land there was to hold them. We found a clearing near the center that looked almost too convenient, like something had kept it clear on purpose, ringed with stones that could have been an old fire pit if you squinted. I told the kids it was probably an old unmarked campsite from before the camp switched to its current map, which felt true enough at the time that I didn't examine it further. We set up for the night. The fog didn't lift with the evening the way fog usually does on that lake, and I remember being bothered by that in a low-grade way I didn't say out loud to the kids. Around the fire, one of the girls in my group, a quiet 12-year-old named Reese, asked if we could invite the boy by the trees to come sit with us. I asked what boy.
She pointed toward the tree line, where I saw nothing but the wall of fog and the black shapes of trunks. She said he'd been standing there since we landed, not doing anything, just watching, wearing a camp t-shirt like ours except the logo was different, older looking.
I did a head count right then, mostly to reassure myself, and got 6, which matched. I told Reese it was probably a trick of the fog in the firelight, and she seemed to accept that, or at least stopped mentioning it, though she kept glancing toward the tree line for the rest of the night in a way that unsettled me more than anything she'd actually said. I didn't sleep much. Around what I guessed was 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard what sounded like kids talking near the water, low voices, more than the 6 I had with me. I got up to check and found all 6 of my campers asleep in their bags, undisturbed, and nothing at the shoreline but the canoes exactly where we'd pulled them up. I told myself it was the fog carrying sound strangely off the water, the way it does on lakes at night, and made myself go back to my sleeping bag instead of investigating further, which in hindsight I regret and don't regret in equal measure. The fog finally broke a little after sunrise, and it broke all at once, the way it sometimes does, going from a solid wall to nothing in the space of a few minutes. With actual visibility, I could see we'd landed somewhere well north of any site on our map, tucked into a cove I didn't recognize, on an island that, once I could see its full shape, didn't match the 2 islands marked anywhere near us. I got the kids up, packed quickly, and didn't say much about it, focused on getting us back to a stretch of shoreline I actually recognized. I did a head count before we launched, out of habit more than concern.
7.
I recounted, slower, checking faces against the names on my trip roster. 6 names matched 6 kids I knew.
The 7th was a boy, maybe 11, in an old-style camp shirt, standing quietly near the canoes like he was waiting to be assigned one. When I asked him directly who he was and which cabin he was from. He didn't answer, and none of my 6 actual campers seemed to react to him at all. The way you don't react to somebody you've simply always known was there.
I made everyone get in the canoes. I don't fully remember deciding what to do about the 7th boy, only that by the time we'd paddled clear of that cove and back into water I recognized there were 6 kids in my canoes again, and nobody among them acted like anything had been different. When we got back to camp, I reported the fog and the off-course landing to the waterfront director, leaving out the parts one didn't think he'd believe. He didn't seem surprised about the fog, told me it happened up in those coves sometimes, and didn't ask for more detail than I gave him. I looked for that island afterward, on every map I could get my hands on, satellite images included, and never found a landmass shaped like the one we'd camped on that night. I checked the old laminated boathouse map one more time before I left the job for good.
The 3rd island was still on there, faint, like it had been erased once and only partly redrawn.
I never went looking for it again, and I never took another overnight group north of the coves, but I still count kids twice before every trip I've ever guided since, and I still don't entirely trust myself when the number comes out right the first time.